Jacksonville, the child was born who couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts. Poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history, this land of flowers.
From WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, traveling on it, that is, the week that was. We are doing some broadcast gymnastics here with the programs because we got a little bit behind because of my stay at the medical center. Anyway, nonetheless, we did Friday Java, so Friday Java is done. So now the week that was, and we'll move to the Monday morning quarterback. Now that will come in time here in the next day or two with it, and possibly today. Anyway, we hope to get it on schedule as quickly as possible. And then we have the New Year's Eve, our 2020 program, because 2020 is signals not only a new year, but the end of a decade. So we'll have all of those things running around here at once. And there is our final numbers man show for this year, 2019. We'll get it in someplace. Now, you may get these on some of the channels a day or two late, and that's not a big deal, but they are dated, and the information is where it is, hopefully. And so, in other words, it corresponds to what we're doing. So, on this broadcast, we'll have Uncle Carl, as we normally do, some polling out of Alabama. First polling I've seen out of Alabama with the Doug Jones race, and then some other things we'll bring in. This will be a little bit shorter than normal, and during the holiday season, it's sort of like at medical centers, everyone is gone. So there are a number of things that are not available, and obviously you don't want to poll people during Santa time, so you're having that situation going all at the same time there, so people are short-handed, and because of the way the holidays fell this time around, it was a situation that on a Wednesday and a Tuesday, so sort of midweek, a little bit different. So during the Santa rush, a lot of people were off Monday through Friday of last week. What is last week, I suppose? And this week, because of the way it is set up, some people will be off Monday through Thursday, depending obviously on where they work. And effectively what happens is, in the saltware business, we used to have a little saying, so to speak, that during the holidays, because of the type of business we were in, was a slow time. And once the holidays were over, then things would pick up in the new year. So you have that dead time. And of course, a lot of in manufacturing, a lot of plants close down around the Santa Day, and they don't come back until the new year. So you see a lot of that built into the economy, and also peppered in with climatic conditions from literally the Rockies and the Montana all the way to New York. So people have had snow, etc., snowstorms, interstate highways are closed down, and some will be closed down. These storms are cycling through, and they continue to cycle through. So those things, all kind of disruptions. Mark Carney, the former head, the head of the UK bank, the Bank of England, he's in his last days, but nonetheless, he's moving on now to climate change and the relationship of climate change to the so-called corporate world. That will be where his adventure will be. So quite a trail. He was originally the head of the Canadian bank, the Bank of Canada. So then to the Bank of England, of course, part of the Commonwealth, and now to climate change. Climate change, very important situation to be carbon neutral by 2050. So you're talking basically 30 years. 30 years, of course, is not as long as one would say, would think it is. I can recall 30 years ago, and it sort of flew by. But for us old timers, it is a different situation that we now find ourselves in, and the next 10 years will be very, very important. And 10 years is not as much. Now, once the so-called business community enters into climate change, and they are in there, then the political system tends to match up somewhat with it, because it becomes a business, quote-unquote, priority. So where does this leave the climate deniers? Well, it leaves the climate deniers out in the cold, because when you have in the U.S., the Fortune 500 at least give lip service to it. Now, Greta Thunberg talked about this, and what happens is in social movements, the demand has to be first made. And once the demand is made, it goes into a social movement, a cycle. Then you start about to build a change, real change in it. Period. This can transition to various other things that have been happening in the U.S. for a very long time in medical science, the medical sector. There's been agitation from Dr. Spock. He was a baby doctor in the 60s for national health care. Now what has happened is talking about not in national health care means that it's similar to the Canadian system, the UK system, where the government of the United States would own the medical centers, and they would be the one. Now, what has happened is we have Obamacare, and his late great Jerry Pippin said that over time people would like Obamacare, and that is definitely true. What has happened, the Trump administration, along with voter suppression, has tried to suppress the number of people that would normally sign up at the exchanges, or the exchange, the Obamacare site, and the state governments along the line that would also be in that particular business. So we have a sort of a mixture of things where you have effectively the attempt to get a national standard going, but at the same time, because of the makeup of the Congress, we did not get single payer. Now, playing like a basketball with the somatics issue, single payer, Medicare for all, etc. All of these plans are very, very similar. Single payer, you would have a single point. Now, back to the social movements. The problem is you can obstruct. Sort of like putting up a dam, but you can't obstruct forever. So by taking off the necessary support for Obamacare and cutting it up and trying to derail it through its other appendage, Medicaid, and putting in a work requirement. Well, why did they put a work requirement in? Well, most of the people on Medicaid are already working. But this creates a bureaucratic feature to Medicaid. The state of Utah has recently extended their Medicaid program, but they were forced to put a work requirement in there. Now, obviously, people that are on Medicaid that are too sick to work are too sick to work. But the problem is that it has to be certified. Now, some of that certification is done using what we call the court standard. That's the standard by which the federal courts certify assets, and then that is done by machine learning, hooked up to major banking and financial organizations. That's just to see if one has assets. Now, there are other elements there, and this is where the problem is. When you factor in the state of Utah, you factor in the state of Louisiana, and these various states that are already on demand, and the technology is not there for them. So what has happened is some of the authority that they once had is being moved to the federal level, and the federal coverage of Medicaid is not where it should be. So this is a major problem. So back to Medicare for All. Yes, the demand is made, the organizing is made behind it. It will not go away no matter what the present administration does. And you have at the same time these elements in Congress that are living in the dark age. It's not going to work. Eventually the U.S. will have Medicare for all, single payer, because the economic levers demand it. And this is the same thing with climate change, now that more businesses are getting into it. But if you noted during, at least I was told that, I didn't watch the television version of the debates, these behemoth insurance companies were running their propaganda during the commercial breaks. Now, the difference in the debates now is that the League of Women Voters used to run the debates as a nonpartisan situation. But they've allowed these television networks, no matter whom they are, to get into that fabric and use their people to answer the questions. Now, they always had, like old Larry was around from public TV, finally disappeared, and I think he's still alive. But the situation is you get the corporate hand in it. And the question that we see here in 2019 is that what you have is this extreme element, and that's in various countries. You can go into Brazil on the Bolsonaro or other despots running around, that you have the Salazar type corporate state in. Some people call that neoliberalism. But one has to understand that in terms of capitalism itself can no longer meet the demand of people. That's why you have people in the streets, literally from Chile to Lebanon, in Iran. Iran a little bit different there, class situation a little different. And it is country Pacific, no doubt about it. All we have to do is point to what happened in Puerto Rico. There the people are forced out the governor, but nonetheless one of his cronies now sits in that chair. So has a lot been done there? No, because you're working within a political confine, what the Marxists called petty bourgeois situation or bourgeois situation. And this is the reason that we have as many problems as we do. We've seen in New York a number of times that now the West Bank is brought to the city of New York, but in a different situation. In other words, it becomes more nation Pacific here. That these attacks on Jewish people, Jewish businesses, etc., is similar, but the ideology is not. And again, you have to separate out these characters that are in there, and we don't really know exactly where that is. What we do know from some of those characters is that they're all traveling in tropes, religious fantasies for those of us non-believers. And this is a big problem when you get into religion and people and their interpretation of religion and a right-wing atmosphere. And that's what is happening in the Zionist state. You have a right-wing government there. And that right-wing government has cooperated with Bolsonaro, has cooperated with the Trump administration. And when you create that atmosphere, particularly through Miller and these white supremacists, now the cat is out of the bag, so to speak. And that is the era in which you land. And the only answer to that is that to bring things to somewhat of similar normalcy. Now we hear people talking about domestic terrorism. For a long time, the right wingers never talked about that. They just had it in the isolated situation. But now that some of these acts have been committed by African Americans, we have domestic terrorists there. And it's difficult to, we're not going to get into that here, dealing with this. The Trump administration recently moved on college campuses to classify boycott of the Zionist state as basically as a hate crime or an anti-Semitic attack. Now that gets into a very funny situation there, because when you start talking about Arab people are a Semitic people. You can't throw out the anthropological textbook to fit it to you. So in other words, you have these contradictions that are running all around here. And then you have various other characters running around here claiming that they are original Zionists or the inheritors of Zion, whatever the situation may be. That gets very, very confusing. So in other words, you have a confused situation, and of course, again, you have the white supremacists. They're just running the basic program of Schicklgruber or Hitler. They really have not changed since the Great World War. But again, we also have this problem here of Wilsonian foreign policy based on racism. Racism in, racism out. He's a man that segregated Washington, D.C., was a Ph.D. out of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. And he would be the father now of what they call neoliberalism. But again, this situation itself will change over time. And if this continues on, the social medias, the Facebooks, and various others out there that have been fomenting this type of activity will be further scrutinized. They will go the way of the flat earthers. They will change the algorithms, and that way less people view them. Now they'll move to other platforms, but then those platforms themselves will be scrutinized, and many of these ideas will be out of the view. But that is what happened, and how this happened was like the anti-vaccine movement. All these are right-wing movements. The whole idea of attacking basic science principles. Why was this done? Because the Koch brothers and various others were in the energy business, and therefore they were propagandizing behind the climate deniers. And why? They were denying climate change, something based upon science, field of meteorology, etc. Well, they were doing this so that they could move the landscape or move the needle. This was done very deliberately. And upon a nation of people that really have very little training in science or scientific method, period. So that is a problem, are in history. And many of these movements negate history. Example would be in Texas, they wrote Dr. King out of the textbooks. Well, all these things add up to these attacks and various other things because they're not teaching what happened in Germany. They're not teaching what happened in Birmingham, Alabama. They are not teaching what happened in Berlin. So that's the problem. Anyway, we'll go now to Uncle Carl, get his latest take on impeachment. Incidentally, the Congress is out of town. The impeachment process is on hold because the papers have not been sent from the House of Representatives to the Senate. Big thing there over the witness list. Excuse me, quite literally the witness list here, period. Now, Uncle Carl is playing a little bit of trick on history here. He's writing in the Wall Street Journal on the 26th of December. Clinton's impeachment was dignified. Well, it wasn't dignified in the sense that it was definitely more dignified than one that we were involved in. That was the impeachment of Judge Hastings. Judge Hastings, Elsie Hastings, was appointed by President Carter, and he presided in Miami, in Florida. And he was impeached and the trial and removed by a trial in the Senate. There's another judge also, I think his name was Judge Johnson, that was impeached for different things. But nonetheless, Judge Hastings went out and ran for state office, and then he ran for a House seat. And I'm not sure, I have to check and see if Judge Hastings is still in the House, but for over 20 years, that is where Elsie Hastings presided there. So his was not as dignified. If some of the witnesses they called in there, it was a Tarzan and Jane show. Anyway, let me get on this. There's always tension between the House and the Senate, even when the same parties control both chambers, no doubt. Each view the other and its rules, procedures, and attitudes with some disdain, but the normal friction between the bodies has increased since the House began an effort to impeach President Trump. There was intense partisan wrangling in the House during its brief Intelligence Committee hearing and the Judiciary Committee's rapid-fire action and the single day of floor debate on the impeachment measures. Congress is already at DECOM 2, he calls it, and could escalate. The Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, insists she wants to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate until the majority leader, old man McConnell, agrees to conditions. She's threatening to raise the acrimony to a new level. Well, not threatening to raise it, it is there. McConnell will have to agree, and they attempted to turn it into a political show trial by putting Joe Lunchbox Biden, and Biden said no, it will not occur. So there's no normal back and forth about versions of a bill Congress is considering. Pelosi is venturing into treacherous constitutional territory. Article 1 gives the House the sole power of impeachment and the Senate the sole power to try all impeachments by attempting to prevent the process of proceeding unless McConnell acquiesces to demands for additional witnesses and documents. Now this is a problem. During the Nixon administration and the process, now Tricky Dick was never impeached, he resigned, but information was forthcoming through the grand jury under Maximum John Sirica. So we did have situations there, but in this modern day scenario, basically the Republican Party has coalesced behind the Trump administration, and this creates a situation there. So will, in the end, the papers transmitted? Perhaps, but they don't necessarily have to be transmitted there to the Senate. They could be at logger jams and have to go to the courts, and then that situation could last literally till the election. Speaker Pelosi presumes to be the arbitrator whether the Senate has a fair process. She told reporters, so far we haven't seen anything that looks fair to us. This is more of an invitation to McConnell to hear her out. It is a demand that he clear his plans with her before. And this is, imagine herself as Ulysses Grant at Fort Donel. That was in February of 1862. And while Connell is a Kentucky like Simon Bolivar Buckner, his position is stronger than that of the surrounded federal Confederate general, strong enough to beat back. Now this is very interesting here, to beat back Speaker Pelosi's demand of unconditional surrender. Now this is interesting that Uncle Carl is comparing this. Ulysses S. Grant, he was commander of the Union forces under President Lincoln, and he later became a president himself. In fact, I read his memoirs, very interesting memoirs, that was financed and published by none other than Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. McConnell, the wittiest majority leader since LBJ in the 50s, won't capitulate. He occupies a high ground of precedent, saying the Senate should proceed as it did with Clinton. The Senate adopted rules for his trial by 100-0 vote with the support of a freshman senator named Chuck Schumer. Well, that was a different situation, but you don't have that. You can't rewrite the history. It was unanimous in those days, not unanimous now, period. McConnell is aided by the perception that Pelosi has made Schumer look like her puppet. There's a lot of propagandizing going here. That's never a good thing for any senator, even if the representative in question is the speaker. Speaker Pelosi's approach is also creating more political difficulties for the Democrats. The House acted highly hastily compared with previous impeachments, as its leaders claimed the president's removal was urgently needed. Speaker Pelosi herself opened the House debate on impeachment resolution last week by calling the president an ongoing threat to national security. Well, part of the tropes here was in the so-called national security, I suppose. Not sure if a S-hole country like the Ukraine is that valuable. Anyway, at least they're having a prisoner exchange there between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. So that is some progress. Ukraine used to be part of the USSR, so that is some neighborhood business that they need to solve. Suddenly, however, the speaker, he calls her Mrs. Pelosi, well anyway, wants to hurry up and wait. She's content to let this national security threat linger in the Oval Office until she gets her way, while the impeachment has spun up activists in both parties. Ordinary Americans, especially swing voters who will decide the 2020 election, Uncle Carl hopes, appears to be losing interest. Well, there's not a lot of interest out there amongst people. I was talking to a fellow at the medical center. He happened to be a retired Marine drill sergeant and SEAL, and he did not see much in it, period. And of course, he retired in 2000, early 2000s. Washington's always infected with some amount of tomfoolery. Well, a lot of tomfoolery running around there. It's not necessarily Washington. That tomfoolery comes from the business community. But the Speaker and the Democrat impeachment tactics have heavily taxed the toleration of everyday Americans. It's not the Democratic tactics. It's the whole idea now of an impeachment process in 2019, and the idea of an impeachment based upon foreign policy. Foreign policy has never been the bailiwick of the American people because they don't understand it. And this is where the big problem emerges there. A lot of people are not even familiar with wherever Ukraine is even located. period, and the importance of the business. But they do understand that if a president or an administration is using another country to try to influence an election, that is not the proper constitutional course, no doubt about that. And then there's the issue of the so-called whistleblower. And the whistleblower, I think it's 1989, 80, whatever it was, the Whistleblower Act came into fruition. Now there's some right-wingers out there that tried to out the whistleblower, and old DJ Trump retweeted that particular thing from some zealot and then deleted it. Well, the president can't do that, intelligent community, but the problem is with the whistleblower laid out a framework that was later backed up by real-time evidence, period. It wasn't circumstantial, direct evidence that people that have testified that were on the call heard what was going on. And that's not been disputed. So therefore the whistleblower has disappeared out of the history, basically speaking there. But the Republicans are still back there. This is trying to get a base out there that in itself, if you look at the models and look at the polling, two different things, you'll see that in 2016 there was a ton of voter suppression in places like Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan. And at the same time, there was a situation that the Democratic Party did not play fairly with Bernie Sanders. And many Bernie supporters either joined third-party efforts, like Jill Stein, as we did, or they stayed home. So that in itself, when you're dealing in very delicate percentages, distorted the vote. Not only did DJ Trump lose the popular vote, and he would have been by more than that, the people on the West Coast found out that, the election effectively was over, and they were still trying to vote. But at the same time, that was on the candidate, Hillary Clinton. A lot of political malpractice there. So in other words, this all made a soup of disaster. But what the corporate media has tried to do is say, well, 2016, if only DJ Trump can get his base out there, and some of the polls reflect, well, okay, he's at 42, 40, or wherever he is. But that situation in itself is an outliner election, atypical election. Now, in 2020, it will depend. In some of those states that had enormous voter suppression, Wisconsin under Boss Walker, and incidentally, Boss Walker is now trying to organize what they call an Article 5 convention. That's to revise the Constitution. People at ACLU brought that point up, and there's 6 states are short of the majority they need. And this effort is not just Boss Walker. This is the various sectors of capitalism that are not advanced are pushing that effort so that they can further slow things down forever. It will not work. So the clock is running in the wrong direction because they know that the demographics is not in their favor in many of these states, including in a state like Texas. If they lose Texas, even with an LBJ type leadership in Texas, a moderate so-called Democratic leadership, the door is open. The door is literally open, and that is where they will go. Let's see if we can get this polling out of Alabama. We'll get it here. I may have to pause. I don't think so. At this state, take a little pause here, and we'll get up the Doug Jones election. This is from our friends at JMC Analytics out of Louisiana and polling. This is the Alabama Senate poll results, polling methodology. Won't spend a lot of time on that, but it is a likely sample of households will choose from the population registered to vote in the state of Alabama for a hybrid automated for landlines, texts, and for mobile phones. A poll where 51% of the phones were mobile, 49% were landlines, and there were 525 complete response to 11 polling questions. The survey was conducted the 16th through the 18th of December. The margin of error with competency level was 4.3% here. Demographic breakdown respondents was 73-25 European African American, when they had some geographic breakdowns defined by Nielsen, designated market area, that's DMA. You'll start hearing that more and more. 41% were from Birmingham, 5% for Dauphin, 20% from Huntsville, 15% from Mobile, and 18% from Montgomery. Now, we'll start to get into some of the questions. Do you believe that President Trump deserves to be reelected? 54% yes, 42% no, 3% were undecided. Do you believe that Doug Jones deserves to be reelected? Yes, 34%, no, 48%, and 18% undecided. Do you support or oppose the impeachment of DJ Trump? 39% supported it, and 54% opposed it. 7% were undecided. If the election were held today, which candidate would you support? If he were running against Beauregard, Sessions 46%. Now this is a little bit closer here, and 41% for Doug Jones and 13% large swap undecided. Tommy Tuberville and Doug Jones, 47% for Tuberville, 40% for Doug Jones, 13% were undecided. Mr. Roy Moore, Jones 47%, Roy Moore 33%, but a high percentage, 20% undecided. And Bailey Barmy, I suppose, I don't know who the hell he is. He's 44%, Doug Jones is 40%, 16% undecided. These are various candidates that are running. Arnold Mooney. Jones is ahead of Mooney, and election were held today with Jones against party affiliation candidate mentioned. Okay. Anyway, this Mooney character is a Republican, Jones Democrat. Jones is ahead of him, and 25%, a very large percentage, undecided. Would you describe yourself as an evangelical Christian? 56% did, 32% did not, 11% couldn't decide. Are you male or female? Females were 54% in this poll, males were 46%. What's your age group? 18 to 34, 14%, 35 to 55. You can see where this is going. Or 29%, and 21% were 55 to 64. And a very large percentage of these voters are 65 and older. JMC Analytics and Polling independently conducted a poll for the upcoming Alabama election. There are two main takeaways from the poll. While absolute majority still support President Trump, his support is softened relative to 2016 numbers, and Doug Jones faces a challenging re-election, no doubt about that. Trump carried Alabama by 62 to 34 margin in 2016. His re-election numbers are noticeably less at 54 to 42. Opposition to impeachment is strong, 54 to 39 for each of the two questions. His numbers are weakest in urban areas, Jefferson, Madison, Mobile, and Montgomery, although curiously in one of these regions of the state he recaptured some of his voters who opposed his re-election on impeachment. The gender gap is minimal. Support and opposition is noticeably different depending on age groups. The 18-year-olds oppose his re-election 63 to 33, while those over 65 favor his re-election at 63 to 34. Senator Jones, whose election was due to both a weak general election opponent and robust African-American turnout, followers of O.J. Simpson faced a challenge, while 34% affirmatively want to re-elect him again, but with one major exception. Roy Moore, the Republican candidate, only polls about 40% on the ballot against Roy Moore. Patterns of support are fairly similar to the 2017 numbers. In urban counties, Jefferson, Madison, Mobile, and Montgomery, Jones ran up 64 to 34. He has to run those up against to 35, against Roy Jones. He polls only in between 51 and 53 against any Republican other than Roy Jones, and against Moore, Jones ran up a 61 to 23 lead. Now, it's a long time, but it's happening here. In suburban counties, Baldwin, Blunt, Elmore, Selby, Moore leads 62 to 35 in 2017. Senator Jones is only polling between 28 and 33 against Roy Moore. He narrowly trails. The remaining 57 county voted 55 to 43 for Jones and Moore. In 17 special election, the party lines are noticeably strong in these counties, as Jones only polled between 34 and 37 against Moore. In summary, Senator Jones faces a challenging re-election, and this race will certainly get national attention. No doubt it will get, it won't go into all the crosstabs here, but what we will go into, one crosstab here on Trump's re-election. Yes, only 9% of African Americans, 33% of others, and 70% of Europeans, for a total of 54%. And no, 83% of African Americans, 58% of others, and 28% of the Europeans, for 42%. And in the undecided category, African Americans 8%, others 8%, 2% of Europeans. You can see where this is headed, and 3% total there undecided. These are the crosstabs. Crosstabs tend to be very important in some things. So a little bit of this we'll put in here. We'll look at gender for his re-election. 56% of the males and 53% of the females. That's on the yes category there. You can see it's very close. For a total of 54. The no, 42% of the males, and 43, very, very close there. And 1 percentage point there, 2% undecided of men, and 5% of female, and 3% for total. And the age ranges, I think we talked about that. The 34 to 18 to 34, 33% wanting to be re-elected. The 35 to 54, 51%. The 55 to 64, 57%, and 65 and older, 63%. The no people, or the young people, 63% are opposed to re-electing DJ Trump. In the 35 to 54, 46%, much closer in that range. And in the 55 to 65, 39% do not support DJ Trump, whereas 54% do. And a 65, smaller percentage, people that came out of the segregated era, 63% of that group support DJ Trump's re-election, and 34% do not. On the re-election here, to re-elect Jones, 60% of the African Americans, 58% of others, and only 25% of Europeans for 34%. And the a large percentage of African Americans, 21%, 17% of others, and 58% of Europeans for 48% there. The undecideds are, however, large too. 20% of the African Americans are undecided, 25% of others, 17% of Europeans for 18% of the total. So Mr. Jones had some place to do something, period here. I will look at Birmingham for Jones' re-election. 34% in Birmingham, that's the region there. Dauphin, 26%. Huntsville, 34%. Mobile, the birthplace of Hank Aaron, 35%, and 35% Montgomery, where Dr. King had his office, is for 34%. Now, if you get to know people here, this is on Mr. Jones, 51% out of Birmingham, 37% out of Dauphin, 51% out of Huntsville, 46% out of Mobile, and Montgomery, 42% for 48% there. The undecided in Birmingham, 15%. In Dauphin, 37%. Huntsville, only 15%. Mobile, 19%. And Montgomery, 23%. A total of 18 there. So you can see from this polling. Now, remember, now we are in, November, December, about 10 months, a little over 10 months out. A lot can change in 10 months as far as Mr. Jones is concerned. Jones, of course, is obviously has to improve amongst European voters, at least maybe 2 percentage points, and he needs to get as many of the so-called non-European voters out of, particularly African Americans, and move that undecided number into decided number. Now, a lot of this will depend on the general election, where it is going there. If it's a very, very close election, in other words, 2020 is very close, our model currently has DJ Trump leading, but not by a lot. So it really depends on who the candidate is on the other side and what political winds swirl around, and particularly the economy. If the economy runs as today at about 2%, 2.3, 2.5%, is more favorable to Trump. But if the economy goes below 2%, then it's more favorable to whatever the opposition is there, but yet also turnout. This is where voter suppression is there, such as what happened in Georgia, scrubbing of people in the state of Georgia, scrubbing of people in Ohio. So there has to be massive voter registration and re-registration campaigns. So that's some of that dirty grassroots work that progressives have to do. But at the same time, what happens in the Democratic Party with Bernie and Liz Warren, the progressives that are running, and how that works out. The voters that supported them feel that it is as good as it can be. Obviously, it's not going to be an equitable situation there because of the way the DNC is set up. But at the same time, if it's a plausible situation, it's totally different from 2016. That needs to happen. But on the Perez and these characters, they have not learned their lesson. So the key to the progressives is to continue on organizing. This is Boston Red in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth on the 29th of December 2019, the last program for the week that was in 2019, as we go into the new millennium. Again, our lineup here, the Monday morning quarterback will come shortly, and then we'll have the end of the year show, or the beginning of the next new year, our decade show. We still need to deal with Kwanzaa. We will deal with Kwanzaa, and this is, I believe, the third day of Kwanzaa, the fourth day of Kwanzaa. Started on the 26th, so we have to look at a calendar here. Anyway, we'll get that all taken care of. Happy New Year to everyone out there. Happy Hanukkah, yes, good day.